Beyoncé girl. Honey, sit all the way down for this one, because the story we thought we knew about the Knowles family is nothing like the story that has been quietly leaking out for over a decade. Beyoncé did not just fire a manager back in 2011. Beyoncé fired the man who taught her to sing into a hairbrush in a Houston bathroom mirror, the man who drove her to every audition, the man whose last name she still carries onto every stadium stage she sells out. Beyoncé fired her father, Matthew Knowles, and the reason Beyoncé did it is uglier, messier, and far more explosive than the polite public statement Beyoncé ever released. Trust me, this one gets messy fast. Let me set the scene, because you cannot understand where Beyoncé is standing today without understanding the empire Matthew Knowles built brick by brick. There was a moment in time when Matthew Knowles was not merely Beyoncé's father. Matthew Knowles was the architect. Matthew Knowles was the general. Matthew Knowles walked away from a stable corporate medical sales career and bet every dollar on a group of Houston teenage girls, led by his own daughter. Matthew Knowles turned down six-figure promotions while extra checks went to a group without a record deal. And it worked. Destiny's Child did not just chart. Destiny's Child detonated. More than 100 million records sold worldwide. Grammy Awards, American Music Awards, World Music Awards. Billboard even placed Destiny's Child on its list of the top 10 artists of the entire decade from 2000 through 2009. That is a father who saw a supernova before anybody else in the industry did and built the launch pad with his bare hands. And then Beyoncé went solo, and Matthew Knowles kept building. Under Matthew Knowles' management, Beyoncé collected 16 Grammy wins in that era alone. Beyoncé released 3 multi-platinum solo albums under Matthew Knowles' watch, Dangerously in Love, Birthday, and I Am. Sasha Fierce, and each shifted the sound of an entire genre for a full calendar year. Beyoncé landed 12 top 10 singles on the Billboard Hot 100 during that era, 5 of them at number 1. Beyoncé jumped onto the big screen in Dreamgirls and carried Obsessed like a lead pop star swinging into Thriller territory without breaking stride. Beyoncé's face was on billboards and endorsement deals stretching from Houston to Tokyo. There was L'Oreal money, Pepsi money, House of Duran money, Tommy Hilfiger money. So when Beyoncé walked into her father's office in 2011 and ended Matthew Knowles' management contract, the entire industry froze. Because a daughter does not walk away from that kind of empire without a reason. And you already know the reasons the public was given were nowhere near the whole story. Now, before we get into what actually cracked the foundation of the Knowles empire, you need to hear something Beyoncé herself said, because Beyoncé has been dropping breadcrumbs for years. Beyoncé said, and I quote directly, "I needed boundaries. I think my dad needed boundaries. I needed a break. I needed my dad." And when the interviewer asked Beyoncé, gently, "Did you get your dad back?" Beyoncé answered with 2 words that landed like a hammer wrapped in silk. "No. It was hard." That answer is the entire video in miniature. Beyoncé did not lose a manager in 2011. Beyoncé lost her father. And the question we are going to walk through, brick by brick, is how the closest father-daughter act in modern music history collapsed into something Beyoncé still cannot fully repair. Rewind to Beyoncé's early solo era. Beyoncé loved Matthew Knowles so publicly and so loudly that Beyoncé wrote a song telling the entire listening world that Beyoncé wanted her future husband and her future child to carry the specific qualities Beyoncé saw in her father, Matthew Knowles. Read that sentence again. Beyoncé wanted the man Beyoncé would eventually marry and the baby Beyoncé would eventually raise to look and act like Matthew Knowles. Now flash forward to today and try to line that lyric up against everything that has surfaced about Matthew Knowles' personal choices in the years since. You can practically hear the sound of a daughter's illusion cracking in real time, one tabloid at a time, one court filing at a time. Some of the most painful heartbreaks unfold slowly over a decade, and Beyoncé's heartbreak with Matthew Knowles unfolded in front of tabloid cameras that would not blink. The first crack came from the outside. Matthew Knowles and Beyoncé's mother, Tina Knowles, quietly finalized their divorce in 2011. The same year Matthew Knowles lost the management contract. Read that timing again, because timing in a story like this is never accidental. In 2011, Matthew Knowles lost his marriage and lost his most famous client in the same 12-month window. And it was not a clean divorce, no matter how carefully the family lawyers polished the paperwork. Reports circulating around the split included allegations of infidelity aimed squarely at Matthew Knowles, and those allegations came with names, dates, and eventually paternity test results filed inside actual courtrooms. Word going around at the time was that Matthew Knowles had fathered a child outside of his marriage to Tina Knowles. That word turned out to be more than gossip. That word turned out to be a receipt. Enter actress Alexandra Wright. In 2010, Alexandra Wright gave birth to a son named Nixon. A paternity dispute later confirmed that the father of Nixon was Matthew Knowles. That was the first bomb. Then a second name surfaced almost immediately. A woman named TaQoya Branscomb came forward, and after a separate paternity case, Matthew Knowles was confirmed to share a daughter with TaQoya Branscomb, a little girl named Coy. That is 2 children fathered outside the Tina Knowles marriage. 2 mothers, 2 lawsuits, 2 public rounds of headlines. And every single one of those headlines landed on a family whose global brand had been built on gospel harmonies, matching mother-daughter outfits, and interview soundbites about how Matthew Knowles was the ultimate family man. You can imagine how that felt for Beyoncé, walking into a studio to record vocals while text alerts lit up with the latest court filing about Matthew Knowles' newest child. The court orders that followed only made it worse. Matthew Knowles was reportedly hit with substantial child support obligations connected to Nixon. Later, once Matthew Knowles was no longer managing Beyoncé, Matthew Knowles reportedly filed motions to reduce those payments, citing the collapse of his most lucrative client relationship. Read that carefully. Matthew Knowles argued, in a courtroom, that losing Beyoncé as a management client had gutted his personal finances. The very man who once orchestrated the biggest career in modern R&B was now, according to court reports, telling a judge that he could no longer afford the child support tied to the affair that helped end his marriage to Tina Knowles. That is not the Matthew Knowles the public thought they knew. And the ages involved made the optics even more difficult. Multiple outlets zeroed in on the reported age gaps between Matthew Knowles and the women involved, said to be around 20 years and 32 years his junior in the respective situations. Adults choose their partners, and there is no law against a wide age gap. But the optics inside a family marketed for over a decade as wholesome Southern royalty were brutal. Every talk show that used to fawn over Matthew Knowles the mogul was suddenly a talk show whispering about Matthew Knowles the man. And every one of those whispers landed on Beyoncé's shoulders, because Beyoncé wore Matthew Knowles' last name on every album cover, every tour poster, every award seat card. You do not divorce a last name in the middle of an album cycle. You carry it. Some observers even wondered aloud whether the personal storm swirling around Matthew Knowles bled into Beyoncé's music that year. Beyoncé released her album 4 in the summer of 2011. And while any Beyoncé album is a commercial success by any reasonable industry standard, 4 undersold some of Beyoncé's earlier solo projects and did not spin off the #1 radio smash Beyoncé fans expected. Was there a link between the Knowles family drama and the softer commercial performance of 4? Beyoncé has never confirmed one. But you can bet that when your family is being dragged across every tabloid in America the same summer you are releasing a new album, that noise finds its way into the numbers whether the artist wants to admit it or not. Beyoncé is disciplined. But Beyoncé is also a daughter. And a daughter watching her father's paternity affairs headline TMZ in real time is not exactly an optimal album cycle condition. But here is where this Beyoncé story turns from a family scandal into a financial thriller, because the personal chaos surrounding Matthew Knowles was only half of what reportedly cracked the Knowles empire from the inside. People close to the situation claimed that Beyoncé's legal team, right around the same window when the divorce and paternity headlines were exploding, quietly commissioned an audit of Beyoncé's business affairs. Read that sentence one more time. Beyoncé had her father audited. That is not a small move. That is a nuclear move. And it is the kind of move a daughter only makes when she has already decided that the man in front of her is no longer the man in her memory. And what that Beyoncé-commissioned audit reportedly turned up became the second reason the professional relationship between Beyoncé and Matthew Knowles could not be saved. Chatter Online keeps repeating that concerns arose over how certain earnings tied to Beyoncé's touring business were being handled during Matthew Knowles' management era. Money that appeared in one column reportedly did not appear where it should have appeared in another column. Now, none of that has ever been settled in a public criminal court. Nobody is calling Matthew Knowles a convicted anything. Matthew Knowles has never faced a criminal charge related to any Beyoncé revenue stream. But when you are the client, and when the client is one of the most valuable performers on planet Earth, and when your accountants raise a hand in a boardroom and say, "We would like to look closer at these numbers," the relationship is already dead. It is only a question of when the funeral is announced. Matthew Knowles pushed back hard, and publicly. Matthew Knowles denied taking a single cent that did not belong to him. Matthew Knowles denied every implication that he had mishandled Beyoncé's touring money. Matthew Knowles even suggested, in interviews, that the entire audit accusation was engineered from the outside. Matthew Knowles named Live Nation Entertainment, arguing that the concert giant was maneuvering to gain more control of Beyoncé's touring operation, and that the audit and the surrounding fallout were part of a larger corporate play to squeeze Matthew Knowles out of Beyoncé's business ecosystem. In other words, Matthew Knowles told the world, "I did not steal from my daughter. Someone bigger than me wanted my chair." That defense accidentally confirms what everybody already suspected. The chair Matthew Knowles was sitting in was worth more than most Fortune 500 board seats. And here is the twist that most people covering the Beyoncé and Matthew Knowles saga never quite emphasize enough. This 2011 audit conversation was not the first time money questions had followed Matthew Knowles. Rewind further, back into the Destiny's Child years, where former group members TaQoya and Latavia Roberson pursued legal action after their exit from Destiny's Child. That legal fight included allegations touching on Matthew Knowles' management style and how the group's finances were being handled. That dispute was fiercely contested by Matthew Knowles at every stage, but it lives in the historical record. And once the 2011 Beyoncé audit conversation started swirling, that older Destiny's Child episode came back around like a boomerang thrown a decade earlier and finally returning to the thrower. Suddenly the questions being asked about Matthew Knowles were not brand new questions. Suddenly, they had a pattern behind them. And Beyoncé, sitting at the top of that pattern, had to decide whether the man she loved most in the world was also the man she could no longer trust with the empire her voice had built. You already know which side of that decision Beyoncé picked. Beyoncé fired Matthew Knowles. Beyoncé did it in 2011. Beyoncé did it in a way that stunned the industry and made every other superstar-manager relationship suddenly look renegotiable overnight. And Beyoncé did it with her own words, softly delivered but unmistakably firm. Beyoncé called ending Matthew Knowles' management one of the hardest things I have ever done. Beyoncé said that at some point in every daughter's life, you have to become the adult your father raised you to be. Read that back slowly. Beyoncé did not paint herself as a victim. Beyoncé painted herself as a graduate. Beyoncé said, essentially, my father built me strong enough to walk away from him, and now I am walking. That is one of the most surgical career sentences ever delivered by any celebrity in any industry. Now let me pull you a little deeper, because there is a shadow story running alongside everything I just told you. And it is the story that the mainstream press has treated with much longer tweezers than the divorce and the audit ever received. A former Beyoncé vocal coach named David Lee Brewer, who worked closely with the Knowles family during Beyoncé's formative years in the 1990s and who lived under the Knowles roof for a stretch of that period, later published a book titled Beyoncé, Raising Genius. In that book, David Lee Brewer made a series of allegations about what David Lee Brewer claimed to have witnessed inside the Knowles home during Beyoncé's early adolescence. According to David Lee Brewer, Matthew Knowles used drugs. According to David Lee Brewer, that substance use worsened over time. According to David Lee Brewer, that alleged pattern affected Matthew Knowles' parenting, strained his marriage to Tina Knowles, and created tension between Matthew Knowles and both of his daughters, Beyoncé and Solange. David Lee Brewer went further. David Lee Brewer alleged, in the same book, that Matthew Knowles' pattern grew so intense at one point that money reportedly began disappearing from Tina Knowles' beauty salon business. Tina Knowles, remember, was the family's second engine, the businesswoman, the stylist, the salon owner, the woman who would go on to build House of Duran, style Beyoncé's tours, and eventually co-found the haircare line Secret alongside her daughter. David Lee Brewer's account describes a household in which the man everybody outside the family called the manager was, allegedly, quietly running down the woman who was equally responsible for the family's financial foundation. Now, before anybody in the comments spirals, those are allegations from David Lee Brewer, and they should be treated as claims, not as confirmed facts. Matthew Knowles has never been convicted of anything David Lee Brewer described, but the claims exist in the record. And once you put David Lee Brewer's claims next to the paternity lawsuits, next to the child support reductions, next to the 2011 Beyoncé audit, next to the earlier Destiny's Child financial disputes, a certain unavoidable shape starts to form. That shape is not a shape any daughter wants to see when she looks at the man who raised her. There is even a line, blunt and dripping with disdain, from within the extended orbit of this saga. Somebody publicly said, and I am paraphrasing, that everybody in the world thinks Matthew Knowles is the devil, but Matthew Knowles is not the devil. Matthew Knowles is merely a certain kind of difficult man. Whoever originally delivered that phrase, the fact that it even exists in the public conversation around this family, tells you exactly how divided the audience became over Matthew Knowles. Some people painted Matthew Knowles as the villain who broke the Knowles family from the inside. Some people painted Matthew Knowles as a scapegoat carrying blame that should have been shared. And Beyoncé, The one person on Earth who could confirm every single detail with a single interview, has chosen, largely, to say almost nothing about the specifics. Almost nothing, but not nothing at all. In 2013, Beyoncé released the documentary Beyoncé, Life is But a Dream, distributed through HBO, and in that documentary Beyoncé finally explained, in her own voice, why she moved on from Matthew Knowles' management. Beyoncé did not say Matthew Knowles stole. Beyoncé did not say Matthew Knowles cheated. Beyoncé did not say Matthew Knowles used drugs. Beyoncé instead said, in essence, that she needed to separate business from family, and that in order for her family to feel like a family again, her father could not also be her boss. That framing is important because it opened a door instead of closing one. It said, effectively, this is not a war, this is a boundary. And Beyoncé has been walking that exact boundary line every single year since. Because here is what is easy to miss when you scroll past the headlines. Beyoncé did not step out of Matthew Knowles' shadow to stand alone. Beyoncé stepped out of Matthew Knowles' management office and walked directly into a deeper business partnership with her mother, Tina Knowles. Tina Knowles had already been shaping the Knowles empire from the wardrobe side since the Destiny's Child years, dressing the group, styling the tours, and running the family fashion line, House of Duran. Tina Knowles has since stayed deeply woven into Parkwood Entertainment, Beyoncé's own company. Tina Knowles continued to consult creatively on Beyoncé's tours, visuals, stage design, and wardrobe. And when Beyoncé finally launched her long-teased hair care line Secret, guess whose name and whose expertise sat right there inside the branding story of the launch? Tina Knowles. So the Knowles family did not fall apart when Matthew Knowles left the manager's chair. The Knowles family reorganized around a different center of gravity. Matthew Knowles was quietly relocated to the sidelines. Tina Knowles was promoted to the co-pilot seat. And Beyoncé sat in the pilot chair, alone, exactly where Beyoncé wanted to be. And you can see that Knowles family reorganization in the family photos, if you know what you are looking at. On June 30th, 2013, Matthew Knowles married Gina Avery in Houston, Texas. Neither Beyoncé nor Solange attended the wedding. Matthew Knowles publicly attributed his daughter's absence to prior commitments. You can decide for yourself whether that explanation is enough, and whether Beyoncé, the queen of choreographed public appearances, could not have rearranged her calendar if Beyoncé had truly wanted to attend. 2 years later, in 2015, Tina Knowles married actor Richard Lawson in Newport Beach, California. Beyoncé was there. Solange was there. Jay-Z was there. The family showed up, in full formation, for the mother's chapter of the family. The family, notably, did not show up in the same full formation for the father's chapter of the family. That contrast tells a story no press release Matthew Knowles could ever write would ever be able to overwrite. Matthew Knowles has always insisted, publicly and consistently, that his bond with his daughters and grandchildren remains strong. Matthew Knowles regularly posts online tributes to Beyoncé's achievements, Solange's projects, and his grandchildren's milestones. Matthew Knowles has interviewed on morning television, book tours, and academic panels praising Beyoncé, celebrating Beyoncé's business acumen, and describing himself as, essentially, a proud father in the passenger seat rather than the driver's seat. But the photos of the whole Knowles family lined up together at any private family event have grown rare across the entire post-2011 decade. And in a world where Beyoncé documents almost every corner of her own life on her own platform, at her own timing, with her own aesthetic control, the absence of Matthew Knowles from the family album is a statement all by itself. Beyoncé does not need to say the words out loud. The empty space beside Beyoncé in every family portrait says the words for her. So what does this actually leave us with? Let me lay it out plainly. On one side of the story is a man who spent his early career risking everything for his daughter, teaching her the ins and outs of the music business before she was old enough to sign her own contracts, driving her to vocal lessons, funding studio time out of his own pocket, and building a launchpad without which Destiny's Child may never have existed and Beyoncé may never have become the singular global force she became. That is not nothing. That is one of the greatest managerial runs in modern music history, executed by a father, in an era right before the father-manager model fell out of fashion. On the other side of the story is the same Matthew Knowles, later in his career, engulfed in paternity lawsuits, tangled in child support reductions filed after the management income ended, shadowed by an audit reportedly commissioned by his own daughter, colored by a divorce built on infidelity allegations, and framed by a former vocal coach willing to write and publish a book alleging substance use and household dysfunction. You cannot pretend either side of Matthew Knowles does not exist. Both sides live inside Matthew Knowles at the same time. And Beyoncé has had to reconcile both sides in private for well over a full decade. Beyoncé's decision, made in 2011 and lived in every single year since, was to keep the good publicly and to firewall the rest privately. Beyoncé publicly praised Matthew Knowles' contribution to her career every time an interviewer asked. Beyoncé publicly refused to weaponize her platform against Matthew Knowles, even when Matthew Knowles gave interviews that could have easily been read as invitations to a public feud. Beyoncé publicly used the word boundaries instead of the word betrayal. Beyoncé publicly used the word growth instead of the word grief. And Beyoncé also, quietly, unmistakably, moved her business operations, her creative collaborators, her artistic direction, and her family gatherings to a new center of gravity in which Matthew Knowles is no longer the sun. Beyoncé did not burn Matthew Knowles down. Beyoncé simply built a new solar system, put herself at the center, and let Matthew Knowles keep orbiting from a respectful distance. And once Beyoncé did that, the entire music industry watched something extraordinary happen. Beyoncé's post-Matthew Knowles chapter turned out to be the most creatively fearless chapter of her entire career. In December 2013, Beyoncé released her surprise self-titled visual album with no warning, no press campaign, no radio single, and no gatekeeper. That single release single-handedly redefined how superstar albums drop in the digital age. Beyoncé followed it with Lemonade in 2016, an album many critics still call the most important record of the 2010s decade. Beyoncé followed Lemonade with the joint Everything Is Love project alongside Jay-Z under the Carters, then the homecoming Coachella performance, then Renaissance, then the record-shattering Renaissance World Tour, then Cowboy Carter, then a genre-bending country era that reset country music's conversation about race, ownership, and gatekeeping overnight. Every single one of those Beyoncé moves was made without her father in the manager's chair. Every single one. If you ever quietly wondered whether the Beyoncé of the last decade feels like a different Beyoncé than the one who released 4 in 2011, that is because Beyoncé is a different Beyoncé. That earlier Beyoncé had a father managing the empire. This current Beyoncé built her own throne inside Parkwood Entertainment, hired her own executives, and moved into that throne alone. Meanwhile, Matthew Knowles has done what a proud father whose spotlight has dimmed often does. Matthew Knowles has toured colleges, taught music business courses at Texas Southern University, and published books including a memoir digging into race and colorism in the entertainment industry titled Racism from the Eyes of a Child. Matthew Knowles is public. Matthew Knowles is not hiding. And in almost every one of those Matthew Knowles appearances, Matthew Knowles takes at least a moment to celebrate Beyoncé, praise Beyoncé, and remind the audience that Beyoncé is his daughter first and his former client second. There is dignity in that positioning. There is also, if you listen carefully, a quiet ache. Because no matter how successful Matthew Knowles is on the lecture circuit, Matthew Knowles is not in the room when Beyoncé rehearses. Matthew Knowles is not on the phone when Beyoncé signs a new deal. Matthew Knowles is not in the front row when Beyoncé opens a tour. And every father who has ever been quietly moved out of his adult daughter's professional orbit knows exactly what that particular kind of silence tastes like. Now here is the question everybody wants me to answer. Did Beyoncé cut Matthew Knowles off completely? The truth is more delicate than any tabloid headline can hold. Beyoncé did not cut Matthew Knowles off. Beyoncé cut Matthew Knowles down to a specific, restricted role. Beyoncé, if you read her language carefully across every interview from 2011 onward, treats Matthew Knowles the way a CEO treats a founder emeritus, respected in public, honored in origin stories, credited in speeches, publicly celebrated during industry milestones, and firmly, permanently kept away from the operating decisions of the current business. That is not the same as estrangement, but it is not the same as closeness either. It is a curated distance, and Beyoncé is the world's foremost expert at curated distance. You can bet the pain in that Beyoncé curated distance is real on both sides. Beyoncé has said, it was hard. Matthew Knowles has admitted, in multiple interviews, that losing the daily working relationship with Beyoncé was one of the most difficult transitions of his adult life. Neither Beyoncé nor Matthew Knowles has painted the other one as a monster in public. But the space between Beyoncé and Matthew Knowles, once measured in tour buses shared and studio sessions co-produced, is now measured in press releases and social media likes. That is a long fall for a father and daughter who used to run one of the most powerful family businesses in music. And when you factor in every allegation still floating around Matthew Knowles, the paternity suits involving Alexandra Wright and TaQoya Branscomb, the audit rumors surfaced by Beyoncé's own team, the David Lee Brewer claims about the 1990s Knowles household, the recurring age gap headlines, the child support reductions filed after the management contract ended, The older Destiny's Child financial disputes involving LaToya Luckett and Latavia Roberson. The Beyoncé curated distance suddenly looks less like an act of coldness and more like an act of quiet self-preservation by a daughter who could not afford to be publicly linked, at business level, to that many private storms at the same time. You cannot control the image and simultaneously manage a father whose personal headlines you cannot control. Something inside the Knowles family had to give. That something was Matthew Knowles' seat at the boardroom table. So the next time you see a headline claiming Beyoncé and Matthew Knowles are estranged, ask yourself a sharper question. Is Beyoncé estranged from Matthew Knowles? Or is Beyoncé simply the first mainstream superstar to redraw the father-daughter manager relationship on her own terms, in public, in slow motion, without ever raising her voice above a whisper? Because that is a very different story. And that different story does not end with a cutoff. That different story ends with a boundary. A boundary Beyoncé built brick by brick over a full decade. A boundary that lets Matthew Knowles remain, forever, the man in Beyoncé's Grammy acceptance speeches, in Beyoncé's thank you notes, in Beyoncé's origin story, but never again the man with a key to Beyoncé's business or a signature on Beyoncé's contracts. And that is the piece the traditional tabloids will never quite know how to write about Beyoncé, because it does not fit into father and daughter feud, or father and daughter reconcile in tearful reunion. It fits into something more grown, more painful, more quietly mature than either of those simplified frames. It fits into a daughter chose herself, and did it without ever choosing to hate him. Beyoncé loves Matthew Knowles. Beyoncé also, at some point around 2011, could no longer work for Matthew Knowles. Beyoncé also, quietly, may not have fully forgiven Matthew Knowles for some of what allegedly happened during the years leading up to the split. All three of those things are true at once, and Beyoncé has been holding all three of them, in public, for over a decade without breaking character. That is not estrangement. That is composure. And composure at Beyoncé's spotlight level, over Beyoncé's stretch of years, is its own form of superpower that most fans do not fully appreciate until they line up every one of Matthew Knowles' posts. 2011 interviews next to every one of Beyoncé's posts. 2011 interviews and realize how carefully both of them have chosen every syllable, every pause, every non-answer. Beyoncé and Matthew Knowles are not speaking to each other in the headlines. Beyoncé and Matthew Knowles are speaking around each other in the headlines, and the space between the words is where the real story lives. Zoom out one more time. What Beyoncé pulled off between 2011 and today is not merely a father-daughter separation story. What Beyoncé pulled off is a full architectural rebuild of a family business that used to require a father at the top and now requires a mother, a sister, a husband, and a set of children at the top instead. Every touring dollar, every branding partnership, every visual album, every product launch, from Ivy Park to Secret. Every one of those elements now lives inside a Beyoncé-Tina Knowles ecosystem that Matthew Knowles helped seed 30 years ago and no longer helps steer. That is a generational transfer of control done inside the same last name, with the same public smile, without a single lawsuit filed between the parties, without a single scandal weaponized between the parties. That is genius-level media choreography, and it should be studied in business schools right next to the way Beyoncé's Ivy Park and Secret rollouts were structured. There is also a piece of this Beyoncé and Matthew Knowles story that everybody in the comment section tends to forget when the outrage cycle kicks in. Matthew Knowles is a survivor of breast cancer. Matthew Knowles was diagnosed and went public with his diagnosis in an attempt to raise awareness inside the Black community about a disease that hits Black men at rates the public rarely discusses. Matthew Knowles used his platform, even after Beyoncé had firewalled him out of her business, to save other people's lives. Matthew Knowles turned his post-management chapter into an advocacy chapter, and Matthew Knowles did that without leveraging Beyoncé's name for personal gain. That belongs in this record. That is a piece of the man that does not fit the villain edit and does not fit the martyr edit either, and it deserves to be sitting inside the story. So where does that leave the current version of the Knowles family? Tina Knowles is still the co-pilot. Tina Knowles is still stylistically and creatively woven into Beyoncé's every major move. Solange is doing her own art and her own music on her own timeline and remains close to both her mother and her sister. Blue Ivy has stepped onto the Renaissance stage and become a public performer in her own right. Jay-Z remains married to Beyoncé and remains a business partner to Beyoncé, even as his own tangled headlines continue to swirl in the background. And Matthew Knowles remains where Beyoncé has quietly kept him for over a decade, respected, credited, celebrated in the origin story, and firmly outside the operating room where the actual decisions are made. The Knowles family did not implode. The Knowles family did not stage a reality television reconciliation either. The Knowles family did something rarer, harder, and quieter. The Knowles family renegotiated its own internal power structure, in public, without ever fully explaining the renegotiation, and moved on. Beyoncé lives at the top of that renegotiated structure now. Matthew Knowles lives on the sidelines of it. And the emotional distance between those two positions is a distance Beyoncé and Matthew Knowles are apparently still, slowly, quietly, trying to figure out how to survive across. Now it is your turn to weigh in. So drop your take. Where do you actually stand on Beyoncé and Matthew Knowles today? Do you believe Beyoncé and Matthew Knowles quietly repaired the deepest cracks after the 2011 professional split, behind closed doors, away from the cameras? Or do you believe the things that reportedly happened behind the scenes with Matthew Knowles, the affairs, the paternity cases involving Alexandra Wright and TaQoya Branscomb, the audit whispers, the David Lee Brewer allegations from the 1990s Knowles home, permanently reshaped how Beyoncé lets Matthew Knowles near her life? And what about David Lee Brewer's claims specifically? Do you believe alleged past behavior from David Lee Brewer's account played a real role in Beyoncé's decision to walk Matthew Knowles out of the manager's chair? Or do you believe the money questions surrounding Beyoncé's touring revenue and the tabloid pressure around Matthew Knowles' personal life would have been enough to end the professional partnership on their own? You already know I am not missing this one, so tell me exactly how you see it. Was the split between Beyoncé and Matthew Knowles primarily a business story, a family story, a trust story, a grief story, or a mixture of all of the above tangled up in a decade of headlines that no single interview will ever fully untangle? Keep it respectful in the comments toward Beyoncé, toward Matthew Knowles, toward Tina Knowles, and toward Solange, but do not hold back on your read. And if this Beyoncé deep dive gave you something to think about, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on your notifications so the next Beyoncé story lands in your feed the very moment it drops. There is another piece of this Knowles family puzzle